Fairy tales have been around for a long time, and although intended primarily for children, it is known that fairy tales have also been used as a tool to influence social-political agendas. Propaganda has also been around just as long as fairy tales, consistently being used to successfully spread all kinds of messages and ideologies. For this reason, it is no surprise that both propaganda and fairy tales would eventually intertwine. The 1900s was a time plagued by war and economic crisis. It is also marked by the end of the old world order that relied mostly on monarchies and imperial figures in Europe. Though already in existence during World War I, it was during the Second World War that fairy tale usage in propaganda became more widespread. Two excellent examples are observed in Disney productions of the Thrifty Pig animation in 1941 and The Spirit of 43, published in that same year. Both cartoons were heavy with Allied symbolism and promote not only the idea of Nazi Germany as evil, but also the sale of governmental bonds to help with war efforts. The story of the Three Little Pigs, published by Disney, differs from the original fairy tale, where actions have consequences and the lesson is learned by the immature pigs. For Disney, the lesson part did not have any relevance to the spreading of war propaganda. The utilization of fairy tales in World War II propaganda made by the Allies and also by the Nazis was successful simply because general audiences felt comfortable around fairy tales, which resulted in the public letting their guards down and becoming susceptible to the messaging of the propaganda that attempted to influence children and adults to participate in the war effort. By utilizing fairy tales in propaganda, World War II emphasized the good and evil influential abilities behind fairy tales, which have often been deemed childish throughout the years because of the use of fairy tales to put children to bed. It is also worth noting that fairy tales were used during the Cold War as well, as we can see in the publication of Animal Farm by George Orwell. The use of fairy tale as propaganda with a political discourse has already been studied, as shown in this journal. Let's take a look. The fairy tale as one of the manifestations of political discourse. It was published in the International E-Journal of Advances in Social Sciences in 2019. Fairy tales at first glance intended for children convey a wide range of implications including social and political issues. For example, the brothers Grimm are said to have played a great role in forming the German national identity. Fighting against the French occupation, the authors believed that spreading national consciousness through their fairy tales would encourage children, and not only to strengthen the cultural identity. However, the brothers Grimm's national propaganda later led to extremes and turned into popularizing the Nazi. Nevertheless, at the same time, it proved that fairy tales are quite capable of spreading prejudice among a persuadable audience. George Orwell's Animal Farm, a fairy story, is an outstanding allegorical novel against the Soviet Union and Stalinism, whereas some of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales can be considered to be some of the best political tales of his time. Now, I won't read this entire paper, but again, I'm gonna make it available on my Patreon for anyone who wishes to read it. I'm just highlighting a few points that I find to be very interesting. Now, let's take a look into the more historical side of the origins of fairy tale. The history of a fairy tale is especially difficult to trace back, as it has been an inseparable part of the oral tradition and folklore well before written literature was developed. Moreover, based on the research done by the BBC, and then it cites a documentary, Fairy Tales Origins Thousands of Years Old, fairy tales could be thousands of years old. For instance, Beauty and the Beast dates back 4,000 years. Wow, fascinating, isn't it? Now, I have two other journals here that I would like to bring your attention. The first is called Learning About Ourselves Through Fairy Tales, Their Psychological Value. And the second one is called Fairy Tales and Psychological Life Plans. Now, why do I always bring these journals into my videos? Simply because this is how research is done. You need, if not primary sources, secondary sources that were peer-reviewed. Back to the first one, this was published in 2010 to the Journal of Psychological Perspectives. So fairy tales, as the author describes, can be understood as something that goes on inside of us. The symbolic representations in dreams, myths, fairy tales, fantasies, memories, and perceptual projections provide keys for understanding the working of the human psyche. Carl Jung, so I'll be talking a lot about Carl Jung on this channel because he was one of the pioneers of subconscious theories, where he brings on archetypes, he brings on subconscious collective mind, and all these concepts are very important when looking at propaganda. Jung's name for the organs of the psyche, as you may know, is archetypes. Psychologically, images can be viewed as analogous to psychological sensations. In her book, Interpretation of Fairy Tales, Marie-Louise von Franz says that myths and fairy tales mirror the basic structure of the psyche. Fairy tales are dramatic representations of basic psychological processes. If we think of the personality as comprised of a very large set of definable parts of principles, which can be represented by images, then fairy tales can be viewed as dramatic and dynamic interactions among combinations of those personality parts or components. To be attracted or to be repelled by a fairy tale indicates that the story contains something that resonates with an unconscious process in the reader or listener, for one cannot be attracted or repelled unless one recognizes something that is personally meaningful. Now, the importance to look into the studies done by researchers is to understand that fairy tales matter, and to use fairy tale for propaganda, it's not to say that it's wrong. Propaganda in itself is not wrong, because you have three kinds of propaganda. You have white, gray, or black. White propaganda meaning what we see nowadays with advertisements for the sale of products, so propaganda is not inherently wrong. But what is important to understand is that even simple things that may appear to be simple, like fairy tales, can be very useful in the spreading of propaganda for the reasons we are reading here now. The third journal, let's take a look. This was published in 2017. As you guys can see, not only this topic was studied in the 1970s, in the last century, but recently as well, because more and more information keeps coming out. So let's take a look at fairy tales and literature. Why? Simply because literature has the power to shape entire cultures and generations. Fairy tales belong to the oral tradition. In rural communities, they have been handed down through the mist of time, unlike Greek myths and the animal narratives that inspired the fables of Aesop or La Fontaine. Only relatively recently have fairy tales been recorded in written form. In the 17th century, Charles Perrault put us, and guys, I'm sorry if I mispronounce his names, okay? They're not from my original language, so sorry about that. Put a selection into verse for the court of the King of France. The best known of these are Bluebeard, Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella. Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella are very famous. I've seen them as a child, and I'm sure most of you guys have seen them as a child. In the 19th century, the Brothers Grimm transcribed fairy tales from different parts of Germany alongside regional variations, and these transcripts joined the common stock of European children's stories. Among them, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Nowadays, stories told to children from all over the world continue to be transcribed. Russian folklore specialist Vladimir Prop speaks that 31 different functions within fairy tales exist. These are the events that form the basis of most fairy tales. The tale unfolds with a succession of ups and downs, as moments of harmony are followed by instability. For example, the hero starts from a position of weakness at the outset and moves by turns to raise or higher positions, or lower positions if that's the direction of the story. Finally ended up in the higher position at the end, because fairy tales, they always have a happy ending. Now, on my other YouTube channel, Dr. Debora Daly, I'm going to be talking about why fairy tales, they don't exist. And I'm going to give a historical figure as evidence they don't exist, so stay tuned. This constitutes the formula for all the hero-centered narratives known as Roman initiation narratives. Now, fairy tales and psychology, the role of fairy tales in relation to children. What all of the stories have in common is that they initiate children into social roles. Fascinating this. Initiate children into social roles, right? Which means the roles they'll play as adults in various areas of their lives, such as family, work, and so on. These stories promote qualities valued by society, such as courage, vigor, team spirit, and steadfastness. They stir deep feelings in both narrator and listener. Wisdom is passed on. They contain a series of messages coming from a cultural parent that the storytellers pass down through generations, especially to young people who are wondering what to expect of life. As we can see, in the collective unconscious of society through generations, fairy tales weren't only for entertainment, but to give social roles for children that are looking for guidance in life. Now we can start to see why they were used for war propaganda and why this is extremely effective. So why fairy tales are so powerful according to the author? These tales were often told during long winter evenings, and the favorable setting allowed storytellers to exercise their talent in a hypnotic fashion. In fact, the storyteller's role is crucial. So it is when parents read their children bedtime stories before they go to sleep, or when a nursery teacher gathers the little ones around her to read them a story. These are opportune moments for the development of emotions: fear of an imagined danger, anger when facing defeat, the sadness of loss, and the joy at the final victory. Therefore, it is possible to see now and understand the importance of the use of fairy tale for propaganda, why this was used, and why it was successful. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to check the other videos on this channel about propaganda and my primary channel, Dr. Debora Daly, where I make videos on more personal, opinionated topics. Thank you very much and have a great day.